Ichiruga name, and the Rastafari community in Barbados honors that name. One of our organizations is the Ichiruga name Council for the Advancement of Women, of Rastafari. My bias is women, so I defaulted to that. But what I want to say is that spaces become sacred if we so designate them. If we decide that something is sacred, either individually, personally, or as a society, as a community, we decide that something is sacred, it becomes sacred. Sometimes we consecrate that by having particular rituals. So we've decided that Newton Burial Ground is a sacred place, and certain rituals are being done. And the ritual here, for example, could be the forming of a committee to raise awareness around it, to preserve, to put signs so that visitors, passers-by can know that this place has particular meaning for some people, for particular reasons. But I wanted to start with the broadest definition of what is sacred, in the sense that everything living and everything around us is really, every space that contains life is really sacred, and therefore the entire island could be a sacred space if we so designate it. And for me, in the context of reparations, in the context of emancipation, the project of emancipation, which is an ongoing one, dare we think as part of that process of Barbados as a sacred space? Or is it special sites in Barbados that would be sacred? So we know, for example, that the entire island was plantation designated from coast to coast at some point. It means, therefore, that all over the island, there are the bones, the remains, the traces, the memories of our foreparents. From the time they landed here, and some events may be more significant to us because we are able to mark it. So for example, the rebellions that we know of. We know that when those rebellions were put down, then you had masses of people dying at the same time and being buried somewhere. We can imagine, because I don't know for sure, that there are mass graves where those people were placed, or there could be scattered graves. But it is typical of any society and any community to have a designated place for burying their dead. And therefore, all over Barbados, if we do enough research and we search enough, then we will find and be able to identify where on this plantation was a primary burial ground, where in this area was a primary space where we designated this is where our ancestors would rest, this is where their bones would rest. So I want to pass to others on the panel to give their, it's to you?
I was going to give it to Zoom. Sure. Thank you. I'm going to say Keturah since you call me John.
Yeah, Keturah is fine.
For that wonderful exposition. I thought that the idea of the indigenous people who were here first, like you said, and for them sacred seemed to be very much part of the normal space. So this idea of sacred being normal and how that seemed to have been disrupted by later interpretations of how we view sacred. The respect taken for all those people who were here before us. And I also thought about the shifts. So when we think about which spaces are sacred and which are not, the argument to me is, when did we come about this shift from appreciating that everything is sacred to only some places are sacred? And as I turn over to Mr. Suleiman Bulbulia, I think about my father, Keith Hunt, who would have, in several conversations with me, would have indicated that if you look at it from an African perspective, then the whole of Barbados is a tomb. Because wherever people fell, that's where they laid. So it'd be very interesting to think about that as we think about what Ms. Babb has offered us. I now turn over to Mr. Suleiman Bulbulia to offer some opening remarks.
Salam's peace. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, John, for introducing. Let me begin by thanking the Barbados Museum for inviting me to be part of this esteemed panel. My presence this evening, I believe, is an opportunity to examine and explore part of our history that I don't think we have gone enough into it, and it needs to be looked at, and that is the presence of the Muslims among the enslaved Africans that were brought over from Africa, that not brought over, but were trafficked from Africa to Barbados. And I want the opportunity this evening to do so, and I thank the museum for doing that, because we're beginning to explore subjects that we did not necessarily explore in the past. And as that becomes more ingrained in us to look at what we're talking about from different angles, it is important that we look at this part as well. So I see my role this evening as doing that. And it is important that we look at it because it's been looked at, and I must admit that there have not been much research on this, for Barbados especially. You've had a number of research done and results in Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, Suriname, and Haiti as well, in terms of the presence of the Muslim among the enslaved in Africa that came over with the African enslaved. And something that Dr. Derek Murray said in the last presentation that stood with me, and in my words, as I interpreted what he said that, you know, the African enslaved were not allowed to bring their belongings with them from Africa. They basically, everything was left at the door of no return. They were stripped of everything, forced onto the ships, and brought over to this part of the world. But what they could not take away from them was the intangibles, their culture, their language, their beliefs, their faith. That was not stripped at that point. That came with them, and that is what we uncover and we rediscover as we go into that history. So I think that part of that is looking at what they came with and what they tried to maintain in their practical lives, although it was not possible going forward in generations. So I am happy for this evening, and I want to look at that part of it as we move forward. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Suleiman. And next we'll hear from my friend who wears several hats. I don't know which one he's wearing today. I know that he works at the museum in some capacity, but I also know him to be a rabid cultural activist and anthropologist of sorts. So I'll offer, I was going to say Dr. Farmer, but I'll be previous, Mr. Farmer, to say a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much, John. Good afternoon, everyone, and those online, and to my esteemed panel. Very humbled to be here to be engaging in the conversation that we can almost state that in Barbados is long overdue by at least 50 years. But we're at this point as a nation where I believe we are ready to engage with, confront, and begin to truly explore that part of our past. And I want to thank Keturah for evoking the indigenous, because it's perhaps a lot more present in our country than we even realize. We cannot always take the European concept that the island was tabula rasa at the finding of it, where you can find where someone already lives. We already have that. There's a really nice calypso around it. But how do we begin to engage and understand that past? The indigenous aspect is both those who were indigenous to this region, whether you refer to them as Carifuna, Garifuna, Taino, or Lokono, but also those who themselves were trafficked to this space. In the 17th to 18th century, some historical evidence is coming up showing that Seminole peoples and those in that region of Florida and Georgia were transshipped to Barbados. What we don't quite know is what happened to them. Where is the integration of them with the African and indentured Europeans? Where do some of their practices somehow merge into ours? Materiality in terms of foods brought, pottery created, basket weaving done, but also how do their religious practice syncretize with what was here? Because for me, sacred is both intangible and tangible. Sacred is both man-made and natural, where within our landscape were such sacred spaces designated or even denoted, and have we forgotten them? And where buried in our memory are they still? Is something that in a way preoccupies me. Even when we take a look at our folklore systems, and we like to scare one another about walking down particular paths at a particular night at a full moon, what are we really evoking? What are we really saying? Because we had to do so much hiding. And I know that there are one or two colleagues who've delved into this, but those people who are studying the diaries of Bishop Coleridge, his expressed action was to ensure all of what he deemed to be primitive and savage amongst the freed Africans that he found here was to eradicate the sacredness. 9 nights used to be practiced in Barbados. For those of you familiar with 9 nights, imagine that we had that practice. Gone. We don't know it. So when we see our young people engaging in particular practices around interment, whether they're emptying a bottle of rum or cracking a long neck or throwing in a credit card, understand what is that a residue of, and in a way a post-traumatic reaction of as well. So that is also part of the sacred. But the other part of the sacred, if we recognize that both the indigenous and the African saw the world as a totality. There was no segmentation between the profane and the sacred. Therefore, particular plants and trees and animals were also sacred. How we used them, what they were used for, when they were used, is part of that ecosystem of sacredness. So yes, I will agree that Ishiruga 9 is a sacred space. And we now need to be able to hopefully reconstruct it where possible, given all that is happening, designate and safeguard some of those spaces and practices, and understand where and how we should value it as sacred. And the one thing I'll end off by saying is interesting about us. We want to think of ourselves as being rules-based, but let me use this example. Every day, most people drive by a particular roundabout in Barbados on which there is a large statue called Slave in Revolt. No one calls it that. It was placed there to commemorate a particular anniversary of the abolition of the trade in enslaved African people. Its official title is the Emancipation Statue. No one calls it that either. As a population, coming out of some public history talks in the 80s in the steel shed, which for me is a wonderful crucible of our non-passivity, Barbadians decided that is Bassa. I don't care what you call it. I deem it to be Bassa. And it is so, and it is sacred. Now, if we can do that for that one space, imagine what we can do to others once we know what they are. And part of this discussion, I hope, is to find out what they are and where they are, and how we can then seek to go about ensuring that the sacredness is not only preserved, but that the sacredness and the understanding of it is then passed down from generation to generation. So I'm really, really excited about this discussion tonight. And the fact that our sacred is not only above ground, but below ground in our caves and our cave systems. Because when we speak to the indigenous, the cave is that conduit to the afterlife. The cave is also a place of renewal and rebirth. And of course, our marine environment, because some of our terrestrial lies in the marine, but some of our marine is also sacred. Can we find out about that? And I leave that note so we can have a really robust discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And of course, we who are here and those of us who are watching will be able to add to the conversation. Just hold your questions. But I want to start with us who are here first. And I want to take it back to my friend Kevin, because you did mention this idea of it being, or sacredness being above ground and below ground, and in the sea, and maybe dare I say in the air, and in the fire, in the stones, in the plants. But what do the people who are missing from this conversation are those who are buried in that space. And it'd be interesting to find out, or to know, or to hear, or to listen to them tell us, or show us, what do we know about them? And I wondered if you could share, what you have gleaned or found out in your capacity as part of this society.
Okay. No problem. All right, so my capacity as, let's say, curator here is helping to manage the excavated material from that site. I would say that if we were to find a site like that today, we would do things differently, i.e., we would actually ask the community what they want to do. But at that point in time, that was not the consideration. The consideration was very much an elitist and academic one. What can we find out? Now, for me, let's deal with the discovery or the rediscovery by Professor Handler and Frederick Lang. They'd been on island for a number of weeks, could not find any evidence of enslaved burial spaces. They went to Newton, and on that given day, ran into an elderly gentleman who they asked, "Do you know of any burial grounds?" And he was able to recount a family history story from his grandmother, that out in the middle of cane fields, their ancestors and their family were buried. They were taken to this spot. For those of you who've been out to Newton, slightly sloping field, sour grass, a couple trees, no sugar cane. They were able to do excavations there, finding both mounded and unmounded burials of persons of African descent. The documentary evidence of the plantation indicated that in the cane fields was where their ancestors were buried. That was 1980, 81. Up to this day, we're at 2024. We have yet to find another similar enslaved burial ground on this 21 by 14 island, where we can tie the persons who are buried there to the plantation on which they were trafficked to, worked, died, and were interred. And the reason for that is this. There was a systematic erasure of enslaved burial spaces and enslaved villages after emancipation, where they were turned back into cane field, where that was possible. The geographical location of that particular sloping pasture, thankfully, did not allow for that to happen. Thin soils, limestone outcrops are very close to the surface. Therefore, it is really rabland. And because it's rabland, it could not find any other economic use. What have we learned from it? We've learned something about the brutality and the malnutrition of enslavement. But we've also learned about the kinship systems, where families had plots and buried relatives together. And hopefully there's more research to be done in that area over the next few years. We understand, because at that time the belief was the enslaved person had nothing, came with nothing, was given nothing, and had nothing. What we refer to as the material culture, the funerary objects that were interred with people, was that in some instances they had, and it was buried with them. Silver bangles, silver earrings, necklaces of semi-precious jewelry. But also, there's a particular necklace, and the bead is in our gallery. It's carnelian bead, maybe 1.5 inches in height, which for me is the embodiment of globalization, because that carnelian bead would have been mined in southern India, western India, made its way across 2 oceans, whether overland or around the Cape, and ended up buried in a field on an island in the mid-Atlantic, where a trans-ship trafficked African person was brought to grow an Asian grass for export to European markets. If only that bead could talk. What could it tell us? But it speaks to the value, first, of the person who acquired it, the value and the sacredness that it was interred with the person who owned it and who died, as opposed to it becoming an heirloom and being passed down. And then also, there are a couple other burials there of interest, of a female who was buried upside down. Does that speak to a particular religious practice or belief about that person, that they were buried in that way? Do we have ever elders and shamans in that space? We don't know. We can only, in a way, rely on oral history on the one instance, or any comparisons that you might have of similar burials in this region. And even in this region, there are very few communal enslaved burial sites. There are large mass burial sites. There are large mass graves, whether we're in Brazil or Curacao or Martinique or Guadeloupe, singular burials in Jamaica, singular burials in the Bahamas. But for whatever reason, we have been blessed with this site. We now need to understand it better, recognize its importance to us and what it can tell us about what transpired. My only caveat is we should not, as has been done, take what happened there and extrapolate it to this is what happened all over the place. It's almost become normative. And as an academic, I find that a little worrisome. I need some comparisons. I do know of some projects upcoming where we'll be going into the community to see if we can locate other such enslaved burial spaces, because it's important. I will state one ever that we know of, and that is the Small Business Center in Bridgetown, in Fontebelle. For those of you old enough, the former home of Annie Wilson. I see some nods, okay. But that site was purchased by a gentleman called Joseph Rachel, who in the 18th century was the richest black man in Barbados, born into slavery. He purchased land on the outskirts of Bridgetown because back then, once you pass the walls of St. Mary's Church heading west, it suddenly became country. Okay, so on the outskirts of the city, he purchased a plot of land on the seashore where the enslaved and free black community of Bridgetown could bury their dead because there was no space for them in the city. They were using the old churchyard, which was St. Mary's, but by that time it had gotten consecrated and became St. Mary's again. Originally it was the original parish church of St. Michael's. But he purchased that land. And that is where both the enslaved and the free black community of the city buried their dead. And we've got documentary evidence to that. I can say, with a little bit of humility, that was my master's thesis. I excavated that area, and we found carnelian beads again. And we also found bottles of wine, they might have also contained rum, that were interred with, again, part of that sacredness of ritual. And there's an actual account of someone following a procession out, singing and dancing, and interring people in that space. And the good thing about that space, because it was sandy ground, the preservation was quite good. And we continue to do some work on those persons to try to understand who they were and where they came from. So for me, that's another sacred space. There's a potential one, the old Manning and Wilkinson car park. Both Carl Watson and Fred Smith a couple years ago had done 1 or 2 excavations there. But we believe that to be the site of the interment space for the Royal African Company. So whereas Suleiman mentioned the door of no return, we perhaps have the space that is the door of entry. And we need to understand what is happening there. And that becomes another sacred space. But it also speaks to how we as a people value, manage, and want to understand our past. Because we realize that we use the term sacred space because cemetery has a different meaning legally. I know we're going to talk about that. And how that then more or less shapes how we manage our landscape. But in terms of interment spaces and sacred spaces, we need to find more because we need to understand. We still don't fully understand what this system was. We see the legacy of it, the negative legacy of it, but we need to move, we also need to see and understand what else took place. And I think that's critically important because it should and will say a lot about us as a people, how we confront and deal with our past, and how we set systems in place, not only to ensure it does not happen again, but to learn from it and to have value to it. Because I will state that I am a proud descendant of an enslaved person. Now, somewhere in there, there's also some indigenous, because I had a great-great-grandmother who was a buck from Ghana, and I only found it out when someone dies, which means we as a people need to stop hiding things and need to start talking and sharing what our family histories are, because it is a rich tapestry of really understanding who we are as Caribbean people or West Indian, or let's find a different word. Let us find if we can, what is the Amerindian word for this region and use it. So I leave that there. Because I won't get into the plants and medicine as a totally different thing, but that is also
don't do that one today. What I wanted to thank you, Kevin, but what I wanted to point out, or what came to me as you were speaking was how much it feels like we still have a little bit of respect. We talk about the atrocities, but we don't want to talk about the agent of the atrocities. We want to talk about the Baragon, we want to talk about where the Baragon is located. We don't want to talk about why was it located there, why were these people in that particular space and not in any other space. We seem to have a healthy respect for this thing that we want to uncover. You know, the thing that's standing over what we want to uncover, even in the way that we speak. So maybe we can challenge ourselves to find a different way to agitate. And as I was listening to you, I think about spiritual Baptist communities, I think about Santeria, local practices, and I think about Rastafari as places who relanguage themselves to bring a liberty, right, to how they experience it. And I wondered if Keturah, if there was something that we could learn from Rastafari in the way that they reimagine their reality that could give us the lens to see some of these things for what they are and not give them this coded respect of it happened, but it may not have been that bad, or we're waiting for some tangible evidence when we know that they spent centuries erasing this evidence. What could we share from our experiences?
So Rastafari might upset the table
Yes.
because death and the departed is almost taboo within Rastafari. And I trust and will live and proclaim a living God. And it is the living being above the ground that is the most important. While we remember the actions of those who went before us and what is significant about it, Rastafari is totally wrapped up in designating the physical body as a temple of the living spirit. So this might be simply an organic and original way that people have always thought, because indigenous, if we think of indigenous Africans, like we are told tribes, they would have had that concept that the human body carries a spirit, a spiritual thing. And just to digress a little bit, my spirit take you. What does that mean? My spirit don't take you. What does that mean in our culture? So Rastafari is always preoccupied with the living rather than with the dead. But to talk about how Rastafari recognizes those sacred spaces, I wanted to go to Bridgetown, to not Manning, but from my understanding, that the shallow draft, that area, yes, but I'm thinking about the water itself now, that place was an entry point. I know the first landing would have been Bronx Beach and so on, but that is an entry point, and where the Public Workers Credit Union is, of course it wouldn't have been, that building wouldn't have been there. That is a path that brought us on to the place that we know as Hero Square now, but which was a place where the human body was so denigrated as to be made an object on the market. And all of the memories, all of the persons who traversed there. So for us, that's like a sacred space. We've only been able to have a bingy there once. And because we wanted not to honor the dead, but to recognize that the spirit of these people live within us, that they are our ancestors, and therefore they have not truly died because their spirit lives on. And then to think about the spaces of resistance that you may find in Bridgetown that haven't been identified yet. So I'm glad you mentioned that place down Fortibel, because there's much that went on there. But for Rastafari, is thinking about how do those struggles live on and where are the triumphs? Where are the sites of resistance? So when you go to Reed Street, for example, and remember that there was a Marcus Garvey group meeting there, and you go to Baxis Road to the top where the pet shop is, and you know that there was a Marcus Garvey group. So we see more the sites of resistance and triumph rather than thinking or being too preoccupied with below ground. Because for Rastafari, for a lot of times, until we were forced to deal with it like a family member passed, Rastafari don't die, we just live on forever. I don't know if that helps you, but that's the thing.
Well, it does. I think one of the things I think about, and I'm remembering, first of all, a poem that my colleague Amanda Camelback wrote for me for a performance I did, and the first line was, "The dead are not dead." The idea being that our ancestors live on past death, and the idea that at that moment on transition, certain rituals are put in place to ensure that person travels on into the afterlife. And maybe what we are experiencing is that erasure of those memories, or that the fear of what would happen if we did hold those rituals intact. And certainly other spaces or other practices that came in had the luxury of retaining those practices. So maybe you could share with us, Suleiman, some of the practices that you would have mentioned that would hold dear to people of your faith, and we could in some way assume that these were some of the similar practices were done by people who would have been trafficked here.
Well, so as we unpack this conversation this evening, it's very interesting, and I want to talk about family history first before I answer your question, John, because I also have that interest in family history where I have roots in Shori Village in St. Andrew. And so my background is one of where my maternal grandmother is a product of a formerly enslaved and a Scottish person coming here as an indentured servant, I guess, at that time. So you do have these long histories that you go back to, and you find stories in there, and you find strength in there as well. And as we speak about sacred spaces in Barbados, and especially as we look at the cemeteries or the burial grounds, for a Muslim, a burial ground is also very important. And we hold those places in reverence. So burying a Muslim is an important practice, is an important ritual. And we try to do so as quickly as possible. So this practice of keeping a body for 10, 14, a month, it's not in our practice, and I don't think it was in the practice of the past as well. We bury as soon as possible. We shroud the body, and we bury the body in a particular direction. And that is one of the things that I was looking at as we look at Newton as to how the burials took place and what position they were in and so on. And those are important teaching moments. If we go to a burial ground, we see and we unearth things, what stories are being told there, these are portals into the past and that connection with our ancestors. And so we have to uplift these sacred spaces, even if it is a burial ground. I know there's this taboo in Barbados to burial grounds. Nobody will go to a burial ground in the night, for example, in dark. You don't discuss these things. Even about a dead body, for example, people are surprised in Barbados that we would actually bring the body home. And we would bathe the body, and we would shroud the body. And we would keep the body there until we can carry it for burial. I mean, obviously under the eyes of a funeral home, because that's the law and so on. But there's no taboo to a dead person. It's a person who has passed away. There's no evil there. There's nothing there. That person should be respected. That body should be respected and given due respect. And that's why we don't keep it, because to keep a body for a while, you have to drain it, you have to put in chemicals in it, and so on and so forth. We don't do that. We give respect to the dead, and we bury as soon as possible. And our burials are simple. We don't throw thousands of dollars literally into the grave. We do a simple burial, and if Barbados did not say that you have to do it in a box, we would not do it in a box. We would do it straight into the ground, right? And you will cover it with boards. So the sacred spaces have to be respected, and they have to be given due care and attention. And Newton, I think, as Kevin mentioned, is a place that we have to treasure, we have to uplift, but it's not simply a tourist site. We cannot make it into a tourist destination site. People who are going there have to understand the sacredness of it and appreciate the sacredness of it, as you said, John, the history of it and the harsh history of it, because it's harsh. I go there and I sit there and I ponder, and surrounding Newton enslaved burial ground is cane fields. So imagine your loved one is buried a few feet away and you're toiling in the hot sun, cutting canes for the master, and you're looking and watching that my loved one is buried right there in front of me. And this is what I'm doing day in, day out. And I will soon be there with them. So it's a harsh reality that we have to confront. As you said, John, it's important to confront it. And another point that I want to add, as I began with, was the slave master and the enslavers wanted to rip everything away from the slave. They wanted to strip everything away, their belief, their sacredness, whatever they held dear. and important to them, they wanted to strip that away. But I think as we unearth these places, we recognize that they were not able to in all cases. The fact that you find carnelian beads within the graves is an important point, because it meant that they had something that they held dear too, and they kept it and they were buried with it. A point of note is that the carnelian bead, which is called in Arabic akik, was part of the ring of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He had a carnelian bead embedded in a ring, and is a very important symbol within our faith. And whenever we find it and see it, we know that it has an importance to it, because he wore one and the followers tried to wear it. And it's not found all over the world, as Kevin mentioned. You can get them in India. I think you may get them in Yemen. I'm not sure, but very few places in the world produce that type of bead, that carnelian stone, that gemstone. So it's interesting that it found its way here. And I'm hearing for the first time that they also found some in Fontebelle. I didn't know that. So these conversations are important to Barbadians as a whole. How do we deal with our past and the sacredness of our past, and how do we uplift that and not just look at it from the lens of tourism or heritage or something of that small nature? We need to go larger than that.
Thank you, guys. So what comes to me is this notion of not only that in spite of the erasure that happened in the crossing, we were still, or let's say our ancestors were still, striving to maintain aspects of their material and intangible heritage. And even in those instances, there was a systematic and sustained attack on their ability to maintain their identity. And yet we still don't want to name these systems that were put in place. First through the plantation system, the ways in which our Christian missionaries were co-opted to create an environment for people to be encouraged to let go of these systems, the ways in which in the post-emancipation period, for instance, people like Bishop Coleridge would have instituted policies to encourage people to let go of some of the same practices, like venerating your ancestors. And even with all of those things, I think we may still have memories, those of us who are old enough, of instances, even within the Christian practices, of certain things. I remember, because I'm from St. John, so if I were to review my genealogy, my father is part of an agricultural plantation, which is buttressed by Mount Tabor and what was Haynesville on the south, and Malvern on the north. And at age 7, I remember when my grandmother died, that the body was processed in the cellar at my mother's house. She was prepared for burial, and people came to the house. I was too big, but my brothers and sisters were passed over the body, and we walked the body to the church and then to the cemetery. At that particular point in time, clothes were turned out, things were turned outside, clothes were changed, and whilst nobody told me what was happening, we could see and sense that these things were not something that you would discuss within the formal confines of church. So there is this way that if we turn our lens away from the formal quote-unquote way of thinking of things, we can begin to see what it is that our ancestors were trying to show us in the ways that we imagine. I also wanted to touch one more thing, Kevin. Why, back to the burial ground at Newton, why were they interred there and not in any other space? Was it due to their particular profile as when they were alive, in terms of their relation to the plantation, in terms of their relation to religion? What was their relationship to Christianity? Were they considered less valued and therefore had to be put in this particular land as opposed to any other place?
In short answer, it has to do with the rationalization of the racialization of enslavement. The enslaved could not have been seen as human nor can the enslaved be seen as someone capable of religion, especially Christianity, because how then can you seek to enslave another Christian? Now we need to go back almost a century before, because it gets interesting how this all happens. In the 16th century, you would find ambassadors of the court of Congo going to Portugal, being admitted as ambassadors, allowed to practice their religion. Over time, some of them became Christianized, and you get Christianized ambassadors from the Congo, as an example, going to the Portuguese court and being admitted as ambassadors. But there comes a point in the late 17th century, late 16th, early 17th, where all of a sudden there's a change. Now, whether or not this change has to do with the Reconquest, where Castile and Aragon drive the Moors back across the Med into North Africa, ushering in European age of exploration, i.e. ushering in European conquest along the northern and western African coasts, how all of a sudden that now switches and it says, oh, we can enslave these people. Because we also need to look at what's happening on this side of the world. There are attempts to enslave the indigenous communities, and we have a pushback from the Catholic Church. And then the Catholic Church saying, oh, we can't enslave them, but we can enslave them. Meaning the Africans who they had been in contact with, and in some instances, who they were at war with. So then all of a sudden, it is okay. If I capture you because of war, I can do what I want with you. But then you have to develop a rationale. And that rationale along racial lines is what comes out. And the church is one of the people who are brought into this and who then provide, let's call it the religious cover, that allows for subjugation and genocide on the one point, deculturalization and erasure on another. And that almost continues up into the 19th century, as we see in Canada, and in Australia,
And in China.
and potentially maybe even in our back door, because empires are interesting beasts. The protector of the Aborigines in Australia is sent to be the protector of the Aborigines in Ghana. He'd done such a good job in Australia. Let him export what he learned there to Guyana. So the way in which empires work. So we can say, oh, look what happened in Canada, but have we asked, but what happened here? What happened in Ghana? What happened in St. Lucia? What happened in Dominica? Where do our systems of religion and education seek to become agents of deculturalization? We have to ask those questions.
Yeah. And what would it take for us to become those agents?
Precisely.
What would we have to let go?
Yes.
Yeah.
And forced to let go. And I'm glad you mentioned the passing over. Should I say it still happens? I can think of up until the late 90s seeing it happening at a funeral, where the youngest child in a particular family is passed over the head of the coffin. But to get back to Suleiman's point, at the enslaved burial ground, and I'm using that word deliberately, I don't want to privilege Newton. I want to privilege the enslaved people. Persons were interred both east and west headed. So there are elements of Muslim and traditional burial practices, and then later on, Christianity creeps in. Whether that is syncretic, we don't know. We might have to believe it is, because if the burial ground is not used post 1838, then there's some type of syncretism going on in the burial rites that are being performed in that space.
You could imagine that there was syncretism because our ancestors were confronted with the option, Christianize or die, right?
Yes.
So we could imagine that they adapted or adopted certain things in order to look compliant, but to persist in their practice.
Yes.
And they would have protected their children by not sharing a lot of this oral history with them.
Yeah.
Still, when I remember myself again growing up as a staunch Anglican, because that's where my parents were trained, thinking that this idea of being English or being brought British was so endemic to generations of my line. When I ventured to, over the holidays, to do the, the DNA test, yeah, thinking that there would be a fairly significant percentage of European heritage, turns out that 3% Scottish, 2% Welsh, 1% English, 95% West and Central African. So just to show how insidious the systems that our ancestors operated in, so that we couldn't, even as we knew ourselves to be African, we could not, or we had a difficult time, or we were forced to, or we let go of those things to the extent that we we only have fragments of them. Then I think about those ancestors who did fight and fall, who remain in spaces such as Newton Burial Ground. And I wonder, how would they like to be remembered? How would they like to be venerated? Because we think that we know, right? But we haven't really asked those crucial questions. But when we look at traditional practices where the traditional systems, regardless of what religion they practice, regard death, regard those sacred spaces, regard contact and communion with our ancestral spaces. And we see libations, we see conversations, we see offerings, right? Are these the things that we are open to as we explore this 21st legacy of what an enslaved burial ground would look like in Barbados? Or are we going to still defer to this quote-unquote respectability and deny that? And I wanted to ask those questions for us here, and for us who are here, and for us who are listening and watching, as we open up the conversation for people who may have questions or comments. What is the legacy of the enslaved burial ground? Is it just a place for us to come and contemplate? There are religious systems who are maybe not as visible, who regard this as a space of importance, as a space of significance, and they will visit, and they will carry things, and they will offer. Yeah? So that, are we in a position to be open to that? Are we in a position to allow these things to happen? Or are we concerned about how it, quote unquote, it would look? Yes. I see that there are a couple. If you want to identify yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Cummings. Do I know to say more?
Not yet.
Thanks to the panelists, very interesting. Had a two-part question. One, I'd like to find out what is being done systematically. Kevin, you are in a good position, we're in the Barbados Museum, to locate other enslaved burial grounds so you can perhaps do more comparative research in the country. And two, just to go back to the indigenous Barbados, what is being done to try and identify, considering this is in the context of the narrative that Barbados was uninhabited, or there were no indigenous people here, but we know that this is not the case. What is being done to try and find some of these indigenous, or find out more about some of these indigenous sacred spaces for Barbados?
All right, so the first question that Ms. Cummins asks is, what is being done to find more sacred spaces in Barbados, and how are we gathering evidence about indigenous identity in this particular space?
Okay. Thank you. Two fantastic questions. Let me start off with what the issue is. There is no robust archaeological legislation on this island that allows for the safeguarding of archaeological sites, whether terrestrial or marine. That's one. Which means that the attempts to locate and identify both indigenous and historic sites which we might deem to be sacred is fraught and problematic. Right now, as a country, we depend on the town planning legislation for the most part in allowing us to identify and, where possible, receive the funds to excavate what we will call a watching brief, sites that can perhaps tell us what might have been there in the past. For the terrestrial, we rely a little bit on the Coastal Zone Coastal Zone Act, which is not the strongest, but it's something. In between there are two others, like the NCC has one for artifacts in caves. Yeah, that's about it. So that's the first problem. What I will say is that regardless of that being the issue, what has occurred, in the 1980s, the Barbados Museum and Historical Society began a project with University College London, their Institute of Archaeology, to conduct, as thorough as they could, a systematic review of pre-Columbian archaeological sites on this island. That, in fact, has resulted in us pushing back the occupation date of this island from 600 AD to roughly 5000 before Common Era. And that only happened because there was a development at Haywards in a place called Port St. Charles, where the museum sat with the developer because of the town planning legislation and had a discussion about the importance archaeologically of this site. And using moral suasion, not the law, were able to conduct a watching brief down to the water table. Because I think people, if you could remember, there used to be a stream that ran through Haywood as an outlet to the sea. So we went down to that level. Then there was that terrible flood in the year in which Keturah died. That kind of ended that excavation. 2 years later, as they were excavating, going down to beach sand, which we think is sterile, out popped a series of what we call pot stacks. They recognized and stopped and called the museum in. And I always use this as a reference as to what being a good corporate citizen is in relation to our archaeological heritage. They did that. The ensuing 4 years field work at that site revealed the largest series of pot stacks in this region. What the pre-Columbian people did to access fresh water, they would dig a well down to the freshwater lens, knock the bottoms out of large ceramic vessels, place 3 or 4 large stones to the bottom, and then stack those pots one on top of the other to create a well casing. Using calabash gourds, which means it's indigenous, using a calabash gourd or their pottery that they made, dipping that water out. And they always did them in pairs, because one, of course, would get muddy through agitation, and the other one would be clear. That is what we found there. Worked marine shell and discarded marine mollusks were carbon dated, giving us a date of 5000 BCE. There's been some other work done that's pushed that date back a little, but it was still amazing because given the geographic location of this island, the assumption has always been, oh, it got passed by because it's out there. It did not get passed by because it was out there. It was central to being out there. What we need to do for the historic is try to get persons together to actually do a similar type landscape study for the historic environment. It's kind of haphazard. We're doing it now because of development. We actually need to bring the people together that we can be a bit more systematic. I can say that next year at Codrington College, we will be speaking to the community to start an archaeological field school again. One of the reasons is trying to locate those enslaved burial grounds, because that space is interesting. That space is the site of tree plantations. Prior to Christopher Codrington's will in 1710, there's the upper plantation and the lower plantation. Then there's the amalgamated plantation after 1710, which means that potentially there are 3 enslaved spaces, 3 enslaved villages, or the research might simply find out there's only 1 or 2, because even with amalgamation, people stuck to what they knew. But until you find it, you can't really talk about it. But without legislation, we are going to be always on the back foot and not able to recover and understand our past, because we've not placed the legislation in place so that that can happen. And it's kind of ironic in a way, because I just came from an archaeological conference in Nevis, and Barbados is still seen as one of the exemplars. Oh, you're doing things right. And I smile. We are, but we simply don't have the legislation. In fact, Antigua has just announced that they're going to have legislation similar to the Bahamas and Jamaica to ensure that this becomes systematic. And we need to do this because there's the potential for sites being lost every day simply because we don't have this legislation in place. And I would also state that if we had this legislation in place, we have then the potential to grow an industry around archaeology and anthropology, both cultural and physical, and conservation. Because when we say we want to be first world. When we look at what they do, this is what they do. Private sector development fuels and funds public research of an archaeological and anthropological nature. And that is what we need to do, especially for a small island stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic.
Is there then an implication that there's a resistance to having these policies set in place?
Well, my answer there will be... No, I'm going to answer it. My answer there is if we take a look at what transpired over a decade ago when there was a discussion about the antiquities legislation, there was a very large vocal minority that talked about people coming and want to take away granny's heirlooms. Not true. The legislation is there to ensure the restitution of items through theft, and also to ensure the retention of cultural patrimony of a given island. And when we recognize that the trade in illicit cultural property is a billion-dollar industry, and it happens in this region every day, understand what our responsibility is.
Okay.
So thanks for the soapbox.
Anybody else here wanted to say anything?
You go next. Hi, good night. My name is Angela Knight. I noted everything that you said in relation to the legislation. It's good to hear. It's a fascinating discussion. What I want to ask, so following on from what Ms. Cummings asked, I have several questions. I still think they're relevant, but I'll ask you them and you'll give me the answer. Hopefully it's a problem. Right. So I was asking, what about your research? That made reference to the fact that you had done some study, but I didn't get to hear a lot, but I just want you to touch more on your study and what you found and what that was about. And then out of the discussion just now, what I would written down was
where would you get the money from? And you heard you allude to private sector, but you went into details where you get the money from, what types of profession you would need around the table, because you made reference to the fact that you went to archaeological seminar. So what types of profession would you need around the table, and what types of tools do you need when one goes on these excavations that lead to finding these sacred spaces? And then finally, last question, I heard reference to the passes over the head, the younger child being passed over the head. I don't know anything about that, so someone will clarify what was done. You got everything?
So Ms. Knight is asking Mr. Farmer to talk more about his research study, to indicate a little bit more about what finances and what experts we need to develop these archaeological policies. And if he or anybody here could say more about traditional practices in the early 20s.
All right. Thank you, Angela. Really good questions. I'm going to try to keep the answers short and succinct. I'm going to actually pass the cultural practices to John as the cultural anthropologist at the table, and also Keturah as well.
And anybody in the audience.
And anyone in the audience. All right. So, what was it? What year? Maybe between 2003, 2005, I'd had the privilege of excavating what was left of the small business center for the Barbados Museum. That site, let's put it at maybe 100 meters long by maybe 50 meters wide, had been excavated to build a building. The developer refused, even though it was written into their contract, to stop if they came across anything archaeological. It was the passers-by on the road to work who alerted the advocate next door that there seemed to have been something there. By the time we were called in, and at that time with UWI, with Dr. Carl Watson, and we intervened, we then recognized that the contractor was only concerned about his particular bill. Because in that process of excavating, they had dumped 2 cannon. Now, if you could dump 2 cannon and not recognize that this was something of importance, that says a lot about you. But maybe it also says something about us and how we value the past. But what was left was a 15-meter length by 5-meter width bit of land, very sandy, which we excavated. That excavation I then turned into my MA thesis. The important thing for me was that we located another burial ground when for so long it was only Newton. The documentary research revealed Mr. Rachel and the fact that he purchased the land for the enslaved and free blacks of the city to inter their dead. And I mean, that continued because then we found his wife's will, which was maybe 15 years after his, still stating that the burial ground was still being used, which was critically important. We then found travel report of an Englishman who was here in the city, according to him, saw this procession of Negroes, followed them out of the city, all the way down to the beachside, because they were carrying a body. They dug the burial shaft, they put the body in, they sang, they danced, they poured libations, the bottles were poured in, covered up, and then they left. So far, that's the only account we have of enslaved burial and enslaved burial practice on this island. I said so far, because we haven't read everything. So for me, that is the importance of that particular site. And especially in relation to the fact that at the point in time, there was only Newton. And it was around that time that the enslaved burial ground in upstate, in New York City had been uncovered. So for me, that's the importance of that site, and it still is very important. There's another portion of the area where a similar strip, 15 by 5, was identified, but we could not excavate it because there were springs. So by the time they went down to a particular level, the spring water started to come up. So that part of the site is still there. There's still interred people in that space. It's now perhaps waterlogged, as it would have been over time, because again, that portion of the island is really the beachfront, because the Harbor Road is all reclaimed land. And if we think of Spring Garden, that is really Spring Garden, all the way up. So we've got springs coming up near down to the coastline. In fact, where Bay Mansion here was a very important spring as well, where 17th, 18th, and 19th century, the spring was tapped and used by ships coming in for fresh water. The joys of living in a karst landscape as ours, all of our waters on the ground. Speaks of particular sacredness as well. So that's the importance of that site. Monies for culture are extremely difficult to get your hands on. The reason why I keep saying there's a need for legislation, because in smaller and larger countries than ours, where such archaeological legislation is enacted, it is the development money that pays for what is called cultural resource management, which is a nice fancy term for allowing archaeologists to make a living. And it means that the person who is trained in prehistory, historic archaeology, marine, terrestrial, the person who is trained in zoo archaeology, i.e., their job is to identify any faunal remains and identify the species, so we get to understand what people were eating. The physical anthropologist who's trained in understanding and discussing skeletal remains get to do their work, so we get to learn more about how people lived and died and what their pathologies would have been. You then have those persons who are interested in the pottery, but also in the what we call the starch grain analysis, so that we can recover what foods were being cooked, what beverages were being made. Again, the conference I attended, someone had done some work recently on some medium-sized pottery from a pre-Columbian site, recognizing that the inside of the pots were heavily pitted. Why? People were brewing beer from cassava. So cassava makes good beer, by the way. You know? But the reasons for this is understanding those life-rare practices. Because when you take a look at what pre-Columbian people were eating on this island, flying fish, shark, sea eggs, cassava, sweet potato. And you realize, wait, they're making things that we made. Cassava hat, because we have the griddles that they would have baked them on. Many of us don't do cassava hat anymore, you know, but it tells you foodways and life-rare practices, and in some instances, a continuity. So I go to a place like Dominica or St. Lucia, and the continuity of the foodways and the pottery production of those populations who would have met and merged and continued those traditions are there. The assumption in Barbados is that there's a rupture. We don't know yet. That's an assumption. Because prior to what we found at Haywoods, we would have said, yeah, that can happen. And it isn't. But it is that funding and that legislation that's important. We're on an island like Barbados at present, where there's so much development going on. There are only 2 archaeologists on island, and both of them in this audience. You know, we smile and laugh, but it's a serious thing. We just had a slight deviation. We just had a fire at the archives. There's only 1 paper conservator on this island. 1. Madness. We have to value our history and culture. Only when we value it can we then be able to put in place the requisite people to enable us to research it, to preserve it, to conserve it, and to interpret it. Because it belongs to us. It doesn't belong to nobody else. Nobody else is going to care about it except us. And if we have those things, then some smart person might decide, boy, I want to start a craft beer industry. What type of craft beer are you going to make? And lo and behold, there somewhere in some dusty archives is the recipe for the type of beer that was created. And we then can make beer from cassava. Now, the other interesting thing that we eat are jug. The main ingredient in jug is guinea corn. Guinea corn is millet. Millet makes a wonderfully strong beer. Hint, a wonderfully strong beer. So who's to say that our ancestors, aside from making jug, were not also brewing beer? We don't know. We don't know.
You keep saying that.
That we don't know?
Yeah, you keep saying that.
We keep saying that because
I'm thinking that we've been practiced to say that.
Precisely. But the other thing is, we've not said to people like you, share with us those stories. Share with us those stories.
I also want to, sorry to interrupt, but because you say that we don't know, right? Because it's not written in a book.
Or we've not got the oral memory.
We don't. Who says that we don't have oral memory?
I don't know. Have you ever asked?
We haven't
Precisely.
asked those memories. Those of our elders are now languishing in hospitals because we don't want to take care of them ourselves, and they're suffering from this thing that we hear is called dementia or Alzheimer's. But there are these moments, if you are caring for them, that you get kernels of information.
Agreed.
But we separate ourselves from our families. We separate ourselves from the DNA, the information that comes to us, from the people who we are descended from. So is it so? I remember Mervyn Alleyne's quote. Culture is under siege. This is the siege of culture that we keep letting go. What is our oral traditions? What is our ancestral knowledge? Because we are told that it's not respectful. And we hold on to these things that have been set up to divide and separate us. And I think we get caught up in this romantic notion that somehow we could use the colonizer language or the colonizer thing to make sense of what we know never made sense for those people who were traumatized by it, including ourselves.
Yeah.
It's a kind of, what they call it, a PSTD. I don't want to use those radical terms, but I think we need to come up with a different way of looking, a different way of seeing, a different way of advocating, so that we could see through the cracks. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And not rely just on what is given to us, because what was given to us was set up to separate us from what we know about ourselves.
Yeah.
So what about oral histories? What about songs? What about movement? What about dance? What about music?
Correct.
What about dreams? What are the other ways that our ancestors or our divine can connect with us, communicate with us?
Yeah.
I mean, we have a rabid history in West Africa beyond whatever we learned from religion about how we communicate, but we never give it the chance to explore. And yet we have these bodies who we would like to say are past, but are very present, who may very well be trying to give us the information, but we are caught up in the way that the information has come to us.
Yeah.
So that's my little intervention.
But no, you were supposed to add a little bit on past practices. Hint, hint.
Well, what is interesting to me is that we call it past practices, but when I go to funerals these days, maybe we don't take the young people over the bodies, but at the gravesite, I see the people walking and dancing over the graves.
bodies, okay.
I go to Second Line in New Orleans and I see people dancing on coffins.
Yes.
So it's interesting how we try to erase it on one hand, but it all of a sudden turns up
Somewhere else.
at a reinterpretation. But maybe that's because I'm open to the adaptability of the choreography of it, and I can probably see those things. And I think that maybe we need to, instead of crying down the things when they come up in the way that we got cried down on, we should look and see what other interpretations exist,
Yeah.
outside of, this recolonizing trope of there is a right way to do things, you know?
Yeah. And I dare say also having that discussion with Rastafari brethren who are maintaining some of those traditions and who have maintained them. And we, because of societal, I need to find the right word, biases, let me find a nice word, don't want to pay attention.
I was just at this celebration of my colleague's life, Gene Carson, and he was spiritual Baptist. And that was a whole day affair.
There you go.
You know?
Yes.
And that when you go to spaces like St. Vincent or Grenadines or Trinidad or Guyana, that it's a celebration of life.
Yeah.
In West African cultures, those rites take 3-4 days.
Yep.
9 nights. And it's constant drumming, constant music the whole time. Nobody's complaining about noise. So I think it's where we have taken on a certain attitude or a certain respect, but in taking that on, we have denied ourselves our ancestors.
I agree.
So not only the tangible, the intangible heritage is been.
Here, there was a practice of a second wedding, which is gone. And for those who would have frequented rum shops at a young age and seen the old men in the rum shop sitting down on stools, and when they finished drinking, the stool was turned upside down and put in the corner. There's a reason why that happened. Because if you believe that you live in a space where everything is animated and that the spirits are always around you, when you get it from a stool and you're not using it, you don't want to sit back down because you might then be inhabited by another spirit. But again, things that we've lost. Some of them are subconscious that we do, but we don't always know why we do them. And it is to, let me use the word, get away from the shame that has been built into our educational system about understanding that past that we need to shed ourselves of. But then again, here we are, we could not be having this conversation in 1975 Barbados. What I'll say about Fontebelle, which is an interesting confluence of space, is if you think of where that enslaved burial ground is, and the building diagonally across the road, which used to be Yorba Yard, I find that interesting. But I just leave that there.
So I don't know if any of us who have any more questions. Ooh, hands. I don't know if there are any questions to be fielded from the live stream. Has the mic?
Yes.
This is my question, but just following the discussion there just now, I grew up in a rum shop, I know some of the rum shop, so I'm familiar with some of them. I don't know what you mean as a child. One I would know here is then you being a lot or being a lot, like that's the terminology.
Yes, that was the terminology.
That is the terminology that would be.
Yes.
But I have y'all have helped me to understand what you want to ask.
Oh dear. We may not be able to, but
And it coming from strands of the discussion from each one of the panelists. John mentioned John mentioned the whole question of respectability in terms of being Anglican and what have you. Keturah spoke to the whole question of how Rastafari were concerned with, if I can use the terminology, liberty. And then, Kevin, in your pre-talk, you was beginning to add value to how young people today of a certain demographic behave at funerals. You know, pointing things, remember the beauty, and how that is not really quote unquote respectable. But it's kind of a liberty.
Okay.
So it started some thoughts in my head that I didn't even know what I was thinking. And I figured that with your insights, you can speak to the liberty, the underground, and respectability, and evaluate, and how these things either are dismissed or they're happening right before our eyes and we're not valuing them because of whatever. So I just would like that to be. But I don't know why one answer, just that it's something happening in my community and I don't understand, and I would like to hear the concept
You want me to try? You want to try?
Okay. Thank you, Joy. Thanks for that, Joy. What I'm thinking is going through your head. Listening to you is about continuities and discontinuities. As the society evolves and we have different age groups, people have different memories. So some of the things that our young people may be doing could be things that they remember a generation or two doing, and in an act of self-assertion, um, insisting on being themselves or different or wanting to express, then they will pick that up. So it could be that some practices are lost because for the reasons that we don't live in extended families. That used to be the term, there might be another one, intergenerational families anymore. Most of the time we're in, separated from two generations. We quickly move and be on our own, and so we lose things. So some things are retained, some are lost, and some are picked up along the way. And now, especially with information being so freely available, people are exposed to the globe, to practices around the world, and can begin to reassert it. I was absolutely fascinated. I said that Rastafari is not so concerned with the dead. But I was absolutely fascinated with a clip that was sent to me about 3 or 4 years ago, where the coffin was in red, gold, and green. People were decked out, and a serious dance and bingy was going on around the coffin. And I said, okay, a Rastaman dead, and people come into terms with it, because the red, gold, and green coffin to me could only mean as a Rastaman. Everybody was colorful. No staid colors. It was all vibrant colors, and people were expressing. And what I took out of that was an insistence that this is just a transition. This person is not dead. We're going to put down the body because you don't take it across the gate. But that spirit is living on. That's how I understood this. And if I might speak a little bit about the practices that we remember and don't remember. Those for me, again, would be, my growing up would have been in Dominica. But for me, there was a practical element. The dead body was at home. Most of the homes were small. You displayed that body sometimes in the front house, if there was a front house, sometimes it was just in the bedroom. But you could not keep it beyond one day, because we know it would start to, an odor would develop, and you had to bury the person before. But because that body was in the house, the neighbors, the relatives, everybody would come and keep the family company. So in keeping the family company, because they could not go to sleep with the dead body in the house, songs, prayers, hymns, cooking must happen, because cooking food, sharing food is a social activity. And people brought things, and they shared things. And then, okay, so the body was there overnight. You bury it as quickly as possible, but then you can't leave the family alone. You have to help them through that grieving process. So you came back night after night, night after night, and this thing went on. And it was a communal event. So it wasn't just about the burial. And we had traditions like a parent doesn't follow a child's funeral. So if I have a child and the child dies before me, I don't go to the child's funeral, because children should follow their parents. I don't know what is behind all of that, but that was something that I grew up with. And the 9 nights, I guess there must be some significance in the number 9 and completion, but I am just speculating here. But essentially what I hear you saying is that you're trying to identify, what is continuity, what's new, what is an influence from outside, and maybe all of us are grappling with that. You want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add that you're seeing the younger generation now moving away from what was established norms, but came really from colonialism. And so they're expressing their own interpretation of how they see life and how they see death, and that is liberty. That is liberty, and I know there will be people in the society that cringe against that, because they say that's not what we're accustomed to. how they dress, how they behave at funerals, and so on. So you're seeing different things evolving, and it's how do we interpret it, and how do we accept it or don't accept it, and that's the conversations that we have to have. I mean, a lot of it is not grounded in anything spiritual necessarily. It's more material. From my point of view, it's not a spiritual grounding in a lot of cases. It may be more material grounding. Example, how they decorate the coffins and how they dress and how in certain things. So it's a conversation that we have to have, but I think that is perhaps what you're beginning to see in our culture now.
I would just add, just to maybe trouble what Suleiman said, the idea of what is sacred and not sacred is being challenged here because it is part of the materiality of the younger people. It is resonating with traditional practices that may not have been encouraged,
Right.
especially for those who are adhering to the religious structures of Christianity or Islam or whatever it is that they were covering at the time. But one could argue that as generations, the more generations that exist beyond emancipation, people are less concerned with following that idea of respectability. Certainly, if you look at it from a spiritual perspective and the idea of continuity and discontinuity, you could think of the information that would have been handed down to you or whispered to you by your ancestors because you are not listening to, they will then go to your, but that would take us into a obia thing.
Some of that.
questions.
Thank you, leading panelists, thank you very much for enlightening conversation. I know, sorry, my name is Barbadian. I know that there is a great awakening taking place, and Barbados is at the center of that awakening. And it's a spiritual awakening. So there's two things I want to ask, which I had to report to people in England. I just came back on Monday. Could you clarify for me the WhatsApp message that was going around for a long time about the Prime Minister taking bones from the burial ground and taking it to Ghana? Could you clarify that for me? And secondly, there was big information shared about the importance of this area of the museum unit. And I'm having to answer or share some perspective, but I would like you to help me with those two points. The importance of, the relevance of, because it was said that the flag of Barbados is very Ghana. I'm sure some of you have heard that. And I wanted to also have some update on if there is a museum being built in that area, which would help us understand the history of Barbados. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, buddy. I will. As to what took place in Ghana, in all honesty, I am not actually the best person to answer that. Because like you, I saw the video clip. So it really is the PMO and the Division of Culture in terms of what took place there. What I can speak to is in 2021, the Prime Minister announced the construction of a memorial at the enslaved burial ground at Newton to commemorate that site not only for Barbados but for the diaspora. And at that time, Ajay and Associates were the architects who were the ones commissioned to create that monument. In fact, we've used the artist's impression on the front of the program tonight, indicating what that memorial would look like. 570 wooden timbers coming out of the ground to commemorate the 570 burial shafts at the enslaved burial ground. And only this year we were able to confirm that number using what archaeologists refer to as geophysical survey, where we use ground penetrating radar to identify where the actual interments take place. So we can say with certainty that there are 570 burials in that space. Whether the 570 are all in that space, we don't know yet. I would say that is to come. But that memorial is to memorialize the enslaved people who are interred there, not only for us, but as, in a way, a beacon to speak about the atrocity and the manner in which we are dealing with it as a nation. And it's going to be only really the second or third time that you're going to have any type of memorial like that in a space in which enslavement took place. There are plans, again, coming out of that press conference, for both a museum, archive, and genealogical center. And that activity is being spearheaded by Barbados Tourism Investment, Inc. They're the ones who are spearheading that particular initiative. The museum's role and the subcommittee is to provide education and, where necessary, advice and guidance. But this is a government project. I will argue a long overdue one, where we as a nation have set out to actually memorialize and have discussions about our past. There's also the spherical building there is also an interpretive center as well. So we'll have different type of exhibits and interpretation going on in that space. So that one I can speak about. The other one I really can't.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Well, location relative to the actual burial site. It is on the ridge line overlooking the burial site. We do, and we've advocated and said to government, once you've identified exactly where, we do need to carry out geophysical survey in that area to ensure that we're not placing it on top of another burial that we simply didn't know was there. So for me, the implementation of proper archaeological management needs to be ongoing as we build out that site. What we've also, because we've found those burial shafts, we are looking to commission some young Barbadian potters to create some small clay pebbles for us that we will then place on each burial shaft, so that when you enter the space, you begin to have a visual understanding of where these burial shafts are. And for those burial shafts, where we do have additional information, the pebble will act as a kind of a QR code for augmented reality. So those are the plans for the future. Because it is a sacred space, and for those of you who've ever visited the site, I dare say as soon as you get there and you walk into the space, that happens. And I will always say to people, whenever you go, you must pour a libation to the ancestors and ask for guidance as you enter that space. You must do it. Pardon? Oh, okay, great, thank you. Right, so we're going to play the David Ajay, the Ajay and Associates video to show what is being planned for the space at the end. So we understand, at least in terms of that sacred space, what the commemoration would look like. You want to play it now?
No.
You want to play it now? It's on behind me? Oh, I can't see. As I say, I have no eyes in the back of my head. Okay. You see it? It's big. Right. Thank you for that. Yes, Bob. Good night.
Well, my topic is about how I think that some new things should be implemented in schools, like social studies, how we should learn more about slaves, and we should also push to advertise, definitely legislation in place, and also advertise more anthropologists and archaeologists to help with studying our history. And this is very entertaining for me because I never knew that you used to pass around dead body, right?
There you go. Oh yeah. Thank you. Okay, but you didn't say your name.
Oh, my name is Satiri.
Satiri. Thank you very much.
I go to school at Research Chemistry.
Thank you. I want to agree with everything that you said. I wish you would say it more often. 20 plus years ago, the Ministry of Education made a decision that history would no longer be taught as a core subject in our secondary schools. So only if you have an interest in history, and I don't know how you would get it if you don't know about it, you then choose it in third and fourth form. It got subsumed in social studies, which as a historian I have issues with. And there were attempts to bring it back this year, but that hasn't happened. But I think if parents and students like you say that this is what you want to see in your schools, hopefully they will bring it back. I will also say I'm really glad to see you in your audience. I think your mom brought you, or you told your mom I want to go, so she had no choice but to come. Whichever way that works, museums exist as supplementary educational spaces. And I'm really, really, really happy to see you at this event. I hope you come to some more. But for us as a people, to quote Garvey, or misquote Garvey, if you don't know your history, you ain't know where you're going. You need to understand it and recapture it. And I say that for everything, because on an island where there are no natural resources, we rely upon innovation and rely upon the ability to imagine. The imagination comes from history. One product on this island that makes a lot of money makes it because of history and heritage. There's a certain trauma behind it, but that is rum. What are the other things that we have in our history that we're not learning from? You know, I'm sorry, Andrea, I'm going to call you. No, Andrea as the archaeologist, Annalie as the artist who is utilizing our history to, in a way, be that muse to create new work and to ask questions. Because outside of historians, anthropologists, artists are the ones who really question our societies. And question them in a way that sometimes, even if you don't want to know, you will know. And that becomes important for us as a society. And biasly, I hope you pick up something in history or anthropology, archaeology as you get older. It is critically important for us as a society. And because we're all interested in making money, I guess, recognizing that the industry that it can create. But to get back to our main topic tonight, it really is for that wider discussion with the Barbadian public so that we can capture, reconstruct the sacredness within us in the multiple ways in which that plays out. I know people are doing it on, almost in silos, individual basis, but I think we need to collectively come together, recognize it for what it is, and really make that push. So that's my bit. I know there were a few more questions from the audience. Sorry about that.
Hello, good night. My name is Newton Development. I guess my question will initially go to John, but any other panelists can answer. So like a lot of people in the Caribbean, I'm born in Barbados, but my father's not from here. My father's from Grenada. I remember as a child, the first time I went to Grenada in the countryside, seeing graves and people's houses. So we're talking about sacred spaces and appreciation of sacred spaces, and that everything around us can be a sacred space. So my question is, we've seen this in the other islands across the Caribbean, but has there ever been a history in Barbados of us burying our dead at our homes, and that becoming a sacred space for us to remember and appreciate our ancestors? Hopefully John can answer that question.
So the question is, thank you, sir, is there a history of people burying their loved ones in their spaces? At their homes. I'm not the best historian, but I do get the sense that, especially in the enslaved period, when the dead were buried, they usually kept them under their homes. And in fact, when they had to move their homes, they would also move their remains. There's also a culture, I think, could be wrong, where you would actually venerate the body. So at some points, it would just be the bones. There are particular rituals where the bones would be kept, and you would walk with those bones because those bones had, what do you call it, ashe, had energy. So there's these particular rituals that would have been practiced were the exact practices that Bishop Coleridge intended to sanitize out of our communities in the post-emancipation period so that he could, quote unquote, civilize the Africans. So if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to give up certain things. You had to give up, I think it was polygamy.
Yep.
You had to give up certain visiting your family to offer them libations or offerings, and you had to give up certain funerary practices. As a Christian, then you had to pay tithes. You would be given a particular seat in your church. It might not be the best seat, but it would be a seat. There were certain incentives if you got married, for instance, where your wives might be able to get up and go to work a little later than they would normally have if they were, quote unquote, unmarried. And of course, then you were eligible for burial in the cemetery, right, under those particular rules. So there was a systematic way to discourage us from those ancestral practices. But I'm not the historian. Anybody else?
No, I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating.
Speculating? Okay. Yeah. I'm going to, anyway, echo what John said and add a bit. And depending on where you were, being a Christian also allowed you access to the tenantry. So similar to what happened in Dominica and in Trinidad. So in Dominica and Trinidad, indigenous people are allowed onto reservations. But part of the reserve meant that you needed to become Christian and Western. Likewise, some of the free village post-emancipation, especially those controlled by churches, one had to ascribe to the particular religion of that particular church in order to gain entry onto the tenantry lands. I know that in Jamaica, into the 18th and 19th century, there were still the burial practices of near to the home, near the threshold, house yard, but in Barbados, no. And that comes down to the enforcement of particular laws. And also I want to remind people of this. Enslaved people are brought into this island, let's say 1630. By 1780, this population is reproducing itself. Okay? By 1780. In fact, Barbadian planters advocate for the abolition of slavery in the late 1790s, early 1800s. Slave trade. Not altruistic, is because they saw competition from other islands and they want them to have enslaved people. So again, when we look at the histories, you need to understand the why of people are doing things. But for me, this population so early, entering into a stage of creolization and still holding on to and transferring those practices across generations down to us is actually an amazing thing and must be acknowledged as some serious resistance. We as a people are indulging in an interesting modality around resistance. Occasionally physical, but a lot of it is practice or lack of. And we do that really well. So that retention, those retentions are all about resistance. Not holding on to notions of home. Actually, the phraseology of my navel string buried here, which is a Caribbean phraseology, you find it in every single language. But it speaks to a rootedness. And that rootedness is about resistance. It becomes important. I'll give this one final example. Bennett's plantation and the Sandy Lane plantation were purchased by the LaSalle's family in the 18th century and amalgamated. There were attempts to move the enslaved people from Bennett's down the hill to Sandy Lane. They resisted. They said, basically, my navel string is buried here, my family is buried here, we are not moving. And there are written documentations of the plantation manager writing back to the LaSalle's in England, people ain't moving. So we gotta do, because they say they are not moving down the hill. They would walk down in the morning, work, walk back up, but they're not leaving their space. That is theirs. Sacred to them. That is the first, there you go, I like that. That is the first Emerton. So recognize how we utilize these spaces. And another sacredness that we might be for another time is our gullies. Our gullies are our highways to and from villages and in between. There are spaces for medicine, there's space for everything, but they're also sacred spaces. Because particular plants are being planted in a particular way to be harvested at a particular time. That is a sacred space. The fact that we plant cassava and yam only at the full moon says something around sacredness and says something about a spiritual practice or a religious practice that we've forgotten. Because remember who it is being planted for, Shango. You know, so all of these things we need to recover. We need to recover and begin to understand it.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks.
You have another question?
My name is Vincent Jones. I have three quick ones for you. The first one is, what work has been done to date to record the oral knowledge of our elderly who are still lucid about stories and traditions that might have existed in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s? The next one is, what is the delay on the part of successive governments in proclaiming the Antiquities Bill and enacting the necessary legislation to protect archaeological antiquities and other elements of heritage, such as furniture, etc.? And the last one is, as it pertains to the sacred African spaces, what has been agreed with the developers of the Spearhead Development Project as it relates to the master rock that is said to be located at the Spearhead?
So the questions asked, very provocative questions. What is the work being done to retain the oral histories of our elderly? What is the delay in the proclaiming of the Antiquities Bill? And what about the Spearhead space?
Okay.
Do we have answers?
I have answers.
Are you sure?
I sure. Precisely. All right, so let me deal with oral history first. There is an ongoing oral history project at the University of the West Indies Cafel campus run by the Department of History. That's one. There is not a systematic oral history project for this island. I know that the Ministry of Elder Affairs, it has been indicated to them on numerous occasions that they should, in fact, begin that systematic recording, because they have a list of not only the people who are going to turn 100, but those close to turning 100. So they know where they are. So it comes down, for me, it comes down to value. That's one. The value also comes down to the non-passage of the Antiquities Bill. Honestly, again, this right now is the single greatest source of change on our island. Use this. Start a group, start some agitation. I find that social media has the ability to change public policy. That's all I will say there, because it is necessary. It is seriously necessary. And Vincent, you know how necessary it is. In case you all didn't know, Vincent is the co-designer of Hero Square. The second one, around sacred spaces. Now, at present, the activity happening at Pierhead and Cavens Lane, there's a watch and brief being done by the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. That portion of Pierhead and Cavens Lane is not the area in which that burial ground is located. That burial ground is located on what is the former Manning, Chalner, and Wilkinson car park, or the old BTI car park. Manning, Wilkinson, and Chalner, thank you. And the museum has written to the town planner indicating the need for a watching brief to take place, which means the need for archaeology to happen before development. We've lodged that with the town planner. It is now up to the town planner to move it forward. Because as I said, there is no strong, robust, enabling archaeological legislation on this island, where the developer would know from the get-go, I need to set aside X amount of money for the archaeology to take place in that site. And the archaeology meaning not only just the excavation, but the post-excavation work and analysis, the storage and curation of whatever is excavated, and then the further interpretation of whatever the analysis from that space would tell us. So I say again, you have in your hand the tool in which to influence public policy. What fora like this does is allow for the discussion around the need for such public policy, but we can't enact it, but we can influence through advocacy. And what I've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is that when we're ready and we use this, Nelson comes down, Hero Square go up, and hotels by Accra get stopped. So we have power. Please use it wisely.
Thank you so much. I know that this conversation could continue for a long time, but I'm being told that we have to wrap. Oh, okay. So I do not know if Ms. Babb or Mr. Bulbulia have any closing comments? Brief?
Yeah, well, let me thank you again, Museum, for inviting me here. And it was a wonderful discussion. The indigenous part is very important for us to start to map out and have more conversations on. Back in 2021, we had that discussion at the level, John would remember, of our Independence Thanksgiving service. And I asked the committee to include an indigenous spiritual worship in that service, and the pushback was great. John would remember that. We had a serious pushback from the Christian clergy as to what does it mean to have an indigenous spiritual worship in our space. But it happened. We got it happen. And I think the discussion needs to continue on the indigenous people because they were here. There is evidence that they were here. They are here. And we need to speak to that. In that discussion that I had then, I was able to get a lot from Corey, Damon, Corey. He took me to Bailey's plantation, to a cave there, which I believe, and he believes, intersected both the Bassa Rebellion and the indigenous people in that cave. And it's a cave that is there. It needs to be highlighted even more.
Oh, because it has been excavated.
It has been, yeah, you can go in.
Yeah, and the material culture belongs to Bailey's plantation.
Correct.
So, who's the owner of Bailey's?
Eddie Grant. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. And so there are other spaces on the island that are sacred to the indigenous people. So I like that conversation, and we need to have more of that, and we need to map that out even more. But thank you for allowing me to be here this evening.
I want to add my thanks as well. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I am remembering all of this evening and Buddy, and I think I saw Sister Amma was here earlier, remembering that in 2011, at the start of the decade for people of African descent, we talked a lot about those and memorializing even the burial ground at Newton and some other sites and so on. So to see it come into fruition and to see tonight that the way from the video, I kept thinking about the African retentions that were coming up there and thinking about some of the fences, some of the old wattle fences that you would find in certain places and realizing a lot of sacredness is around us. We just never knew. We didn't get the information as to what those things signify. But I cannot help think that there is a link in terms of remembering and reproducing and transferring this message in a material way, even if we're not free to speak it. So thank you very much to the museum for putting on that series. And it's important conversation that the more we have it is the more the younger generation can hear it and know of it. Some of us are making efforts in our own families to bridge, and bring the generations together. But events like these are important for pushing that and popularizing that. So many times I heard you talk about excavating and managing and preserving, and I kept saying under my breath, popularizing,
Yes.
because we need to share it. And this is one such way of doing that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keturah. I don't know, I don't really have anything more to add, but to say thank you for coming, continue to advocate for the conservation and preservation and education around our history, our heritage, and our culture. It is important, and is more important than you recognize. And if you know or can think of those sacred spaces, please share them with us, because we do need to begin to map them so that we can seek to have them safeguarded. So thank you very much.
Right, so I want to thank the panel, and I want to thank you all for coming. I wanted to share just a brief provocation in that, we talk about their sacred spaces, but we actually live, this is a sacred space, and there may be spaces of significance. Maybe we need to think about that. We could also think about visioning, because with the vision comes the manifestation of the material, so that as we change our mindset to tune into those things which are part of our ancestry, that we may be able to vision them and then we'll be able to see them and to live them. So continue to live. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.